Planet Institute.
The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. These lines by William Wordsworth, written more than 2 centuries ago, remind us that there is a scientific, human, and biological necessity to take seriously the notion of planetary well-being. If Wordsworth felt we were out of tune with nature in his own era, current data are even more uncomfortable. Emissions rising, species disappearing, ice shrinking, and extreme weather becoming our new normal. These are not marginal events. They shape economies, infrastructures, health, migration, and increasingly, and by necessity, education itself. For decades, education systems quietly served the age of extraction, training the labor force, optimizing production, integrating nations into a global marketplace. And yet, here we are, facing the consequences of that modernity. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. So today's question is not simply what knowledge we pass on, but what ways of being we normalize. Are we educating minds to compete in a damaged world, or educating humanity to heal it? Planetary well-being, as our guests throughout this series suggest, is not a state we arrive at. It is a relationship to be practiced, with ecosystems, with future generations, with communities, and with all the living systems that make human life possible. Welcome to React, Reimagining Education in the Age of Crises and Transitions, a podcast from the Learning Planet Institute. I'm Raphael Costambeys-Kempczynski. In this episode, Reimagining Education for Planetary Wellbeing, we ask how education can help humanity learn to live within the planetary boundaries that define our common future. Can we reorient our schools and universities toward ecological interdependence, regeneration, and mutual care? And how do we move from abstraction to practice? My guests today bring 3 different and deeply complementary perspectives. Iveta Silova is professor at Arizona State University. Her work explores the futures of education, comparative policy, and the possibilities of pluriversal learning beyond the limits of Western modernity. Iveta, welcome to the program. Hello.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
And I have to remind our listeners, of course, that we are recording this podcast series in a hybrid format. So Iveta is on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean in Phoenix, are you?
I'm in Phoenix, and we are experiencing probably one of the warmest Decembers in history, recorded history.
Well, so yes, this brings us back to our planet's well-being, indeed. But just to bring in this concept again of pluriversal learning, could you tell us a bit more about that?
Absolutely. So at the core of the idea of the pluriverse and pluriversal learning, that there is no one single story or one single way of learning, something that mass schooling, modern mass schooling in particular, has really ingrained so deeply in our institutions and in our minds. It's kind of the idea of a single story. A university, for that matter, is part of it too. Kind of a universal answer to everything, that there is one way of doing things, so one way of learning. So the idea of pluriversal learning is opening space for many stories, not erasing other stories, not overriding multiple stories that already exist, opening the space both for multiple stories and the multiple worlds that these stories bring into life.
So you speak of multiple stories, multiple worlds.
And multiple ways of learning.
multiple ways of learning, indeed. And you also talk about the fact that our pathways of development are not linear, and about reshaping our imaginaries and how education's role serves to reimagine, or should serve to reimagine, our imaginaries. In this moment of environmental crisis, what does planetary well-being mean exactly to you? And how might education help us relearn our place within a larger, so I was going to say a larger living system, but maybe I should say larger living systems?
So when I think about planetary well-being, I actually don't worry about the planet itself at all, because the Earth will survive us. It has
Absolutely.
outlived far worse. It has survived ice ages and meteor strikes and extinctions. But what keeps me up at night is actually us and our well-being and the web of relationships that makes life possible. So when I talk about well-being or saving the planet, I think when we talk about saving the planet, we're already starting from the wrong story, because the planet doesn't need saving, because the story we've been taught that only, the story where humans stand above nature, where they control it, extract from it, perfect it, that story is collapsing already, and it doesn't make sense, and it never really matched how the world actually works. So education has been reinforcing that story for decades. As you already mentioned in your introduction, we've trained people to be productive, to be competitive, to be successful in a system that rewards extraction. We prepare students to optimize and to accelerate, but not to pause and kind of think about the place where they are, not to notice the worlds that they are part of. And meanwhile, outside the classroom, we are watching real-time feedback from the Earth through the rising temperatures, the fires, the floods, the collapsing ecosystems, the psychological distress, the social fragmentation. So it's not the planet that is in crisis, it's humanity that's trying to make sense of a world we've pushed out of balance. And education really hasn't caught up yet. We are still teaching as if everything is stable, as if the future will look like the past, but better with technology, especially now in the age of AI. So if planetary well-being is going to mean anything meaningful, education has to help us rewrite this larger narrative entirely. It has to help us shift from this mindset of control to a mindset of interdependence. And I will want to maybe pick up on that thread later again, to see that our well-being depends on the well-being of the systems that sustain us, the ecological systems, the social, emotional, and generational. So planetary well-being isn't, for me, a nicer version of sustainability. It's a kind of the sustainability as we think it in terms of SDGs, especially Sustainable Development Goals. For me, it's a completely different orientation. It asks us to stop centering humans as the main protagonists of the story and start understanding ourselves as only one strand in a living and evolving web of life. And so that shift isn't optional anymore. I think it's really a matter of survival at this stage. So for me, planetary well-being begins when education quits preparing people to succeed in a systems that is actively failing, and instead helps us to imagine how to build something different entirely, something that doesn't confuse domination with intelligence, and something that teaches us how to belong to the world again before the world reminds us, even in harsher ways, that we were never really separate from it in the first place.
Thank you very much, Iveta. And I liked this image, this very tangible, concrete image of the feedback loop that the planet seems to be manifesting quite violently sometimes, as you say, the sort of these climate issues that we're confronting that you were mentioning earlier, sort of living through one of the hottest months of December in living history, or perhaps since the beginning of existing records. Thank you very much, Iveta. We're also joined by Manon Sala, who is a researcher, writer, and fellow at the Learning Planet Institute. Your book, Manon, Être vivant, living beings. Yeah, is that a good translation?
Being alive and living beings.
Being alive and living beings. In your book, you explore the ecological self, asking how we might cultivate eco-awareness, relational knowledge, and the inner dimensions of transition through education. Your work invites us to imagine learning as an ecological practice, a way of belonging to the living world. So if planetary well-being demands an inner shift, a different sense of who we are in relation to the world, how must education change to cultivate that kind of ecological consciousness?
Thank you, Raphael, for inviting me, and thank you for this question. I believe that we should shift the objective of education, as Iveta said. Before we were more focused, or we are still focused in an objective of competitivity, reaching some goals, for instance, the exams at the university. But doing that, we are really going out of a learner-centered approach, where we really focus on the needs of the learners themselves, because we are more interested in what types of competencies they will bring to the world and how will they go into the marketplace. So including this aspect of education is listening to the needs of the learners and being able to understand how do their needs include them in the global history of our planetary system. And so it's related to emotional needs, affective needs, but also social needs of belonging to a global culture of being a planetizen. So it's both reorienting our pedagogies with the objectives of this education system to intertwine this vision of being centered of the human needs as planetary beings.
You mentioned quite a new term, planetism. How do we define that term?
This term is not mine, it's from François Tadé's term, and he defines it as it's opening the definition of citizenship, where we used to belong to a city, to a country, to Europe, for instance, but here the idea is to being part of a wider nationality, which is a part of the planet itself. So our frontiers, our borders are open to the entire world, and not to a country which has been socially, historically built. It's more that we are part of this global history of living things, living beings, and we are biologically speaking, we are a species between other species, and as humans, we can also identify as how our particularity gives us the present to take care and to insert ourselves in this global identity of being part of this world.
Listening to you, it reminds me, I suppose, that we need to consistently approach things systemically. That seems to be what one of your underlying messages.
Yes, but also it's about constructing ourselves and our feeling of belonging on interdependency. Is not only having a connective way of thinking which is systemic, but it's also how we can be touched by the world itself, and how do we reorient our capacity to care of what is not human on other human beings. So it's also perceptive, attentional, and it's about care. It's ethic, finally, it's moral. It's an ethical moral, but not related to only thoughts, but also our feelings of the world itself.
I like this idea of extending the notion of care beyond, indeed, human society and human civilization, which is a fundamental preoccupation still today, of course, for our societies, but extending it beyond the understanding or the I suppose, the human society-centric approach that we've had up until now and making it a planetary question. Thank you very much, Manon. And we are also joined today by Victoria Haro, who is co-founder and rector of UMA. I'm going to try this now. So that's the Universidad del Medio Ambiente in Mexico. So the accent, I know, is awful. Victoria, you are a lawyer, a scholar, a systems leader who has worked across sustainability, migration, public policy, and higher education. Your university is a real-world experiment in what happens when planetary well-being becomes the very purpose of higher education. So UMA is a test case for what an eco-centered university might look like. What does education become when planetary well-being rather than economic competitiveness, which Manon referred to in her previous answer. So what happens when planetary well-being rather than economic competitiveness sits at its heart?
Hi, thank you for the question, Raphael, and hi, Iveta, hi, Manon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And Universidad del Medio Ambiente, we call it UMA, not UMA. So
All
that
right.
sounds strange.
That's going to help me.
UMA for us is already, sort of her name. It's the name of the lady. So at UMA, indeed, we have as purpose what we call intergenerational well-being. So it's another way of speaking about planetary well-being, just making explicit that we're speaking about human and ecosystemic well-being. Some people, when they hear planetary well-being, might think we're only speaking about the planet, but as Iveta was mentioning, we're not. We're speaking about the interrelationship between of life, the web of life, but indeed human well-being. Present generations and future generations require the well-being of all the ecosystems. So we speak about intergenerational well-being to make explicit that we're not only thinking about the present, but very much thinking also about the future. And I do mean also. So I think it is very important in terms of the type of education we are thinking about, and specifically at UMA, that it's not that we only need the present to be better, we need the future to be better, but we don't want the future to be better with a present that is not better, because we could actually do either. We could have a very sacrificial present so that the future is better, or we could have an excellent or a much better present sacrificing the future. So the challenge here is how are we going to be successful on intergenerational well-being? And that requires an education that invites human creativity and collaboration. That's the complete other side of the story in terms of competition. So it's not about how me individually, how am I going to be successful professionally, but rather the invitation of how are we as a species going to put our creativity, our intelligence, our emotions, our visions in terms of imagining and actualizing a present and a future that is serving intergenerational well-being. So we have to learn how to collaborate, how to co-create, how to co-inspire ourselves in terms of creativity, but also how to explore. So it's not only about ideas and visions, it's very much from UMA's point of view about exploring and doing. So UMA is a project-based university where we invite our students to learn how to learn collaboratively, in a collaborative way, how to also collaborate in projects, but also how to put science in service of projects. So how do we learn how to measure regeneration and explore what does it mean in each possible reality that the students have access to start evolving our relationships and our ways of living and being and producing and consuming and basically everything we do towards the possibility of that being in service of intergenerational well-being. And actually, it's not clear what does that mean. It's not that we have a very clear definition and it's okay, this is what it is and now work for it. No, we're in the moment, which is quite an exciting moment, I think, for humanity, where we are figuring it out. We're starting. I don't think we will in this generation, but it's very exciting to be part of the generation that started the question. No, right now, this moment where we are alive, it's when the question started. So, what does this mean? What does intergenerational well-being might look like? What do we have to do for this? So, there's on the one hand, many people thinking this question, and from another perspective, very few. But there is quite a gang thinking about it, which is exciting. And so the educational processes around this question are about collaborating to find answers to it. That's the way I would see it.
So, yeah, there are people, but as you say, perhaps not enough people working on what a definition of intergenerational well-being might be, but it's an exciting time to indeed be defining new concepts like this one. But I was wondering if, listening to you and thinking back to Iveta's previous answer, what you were saying earlier, Iveta, that there is undoubtedly a notion of legacy, and I think that the concept of the good ancestor also comes to mind. Is what planet are we leaving, not behind for the planet's sake, because the planet will outlive us, but what planet are we leaving for the generation of our children and our children's children?
Yes, indeed. And speaking about the good ancestor, I think it's also very valuable to think about the good ancestors we've already had.
Mhm.
So Iveta was speaking about narratives and stories. And
Yeah.
I think the narrative that we have inherited, or especially this is very relevant for children right now, the idea, the story that they are inheriting, a world that is damaged, completely damaged, is not, it's not a true story to begin with. And it really does not honor the very hard work that our ancestors have done in terms of regeneration, because we do belong to a very old tribe of regenerators. The tribe of regenerators has existed from the very first moment humans touched this planet. Of course, also the tribe of degenerators, but we right now in the present are privileged with having many liberties and many benefits that have not existed ever. So this is something we have to be grateful for many ancestors that gave their lives and their energy and their intelligence towards creating these conditions for us. So intergenerational well-being is not something new, it's something we are experiencing right now in many ways. In many other ways not, but there are many ways that we do need to, I think, appreciate and honor, and our stories have to be in line with this in terms of appreciating this, in terms of that tribe feeling we belong to an old tribe that has been working for a long time, and each generation has a new challenge and a new work to do. But that starts with appreciating the work of those behind us, I think.
So let's thank you very much, Victoria. Let's circle back. I'm going to take this opportunity to circle back to this question of narratives and new narratives, stories and new stories. Iveta, you argue that education is not just about content, but about the stories we tell, and we tell about the world. If our current stories have brought us then to, dare I say, ecological collapse, what new stories for you must education help us imagine?
Thank you, Raphael, for this question. And thank you, Victoria, for already starting this conversation. So I actually want to pick up on some things that you just shared with us. There are already so many stories that are all around us. And I would actually argue that maybe we actually don't need to invent new stories at all. In fact, maybe part of the problem is that we are addicted to this idea of always running for more new stories and more new innovations, new visions, the new futures. We keep thinking that if we just invent the right story, we can innovate our way out of the ecological collapse. And but I think that is exactly the problem. And I think that impulse, this desire to rewrite reality from a position of control, that's the part of the old story. So actually that's something that we need to distance ourselves from, because it's the same logic that got us into the crisis in the first place, right? I think the idea is not to replace this story that is collapsing with another universal story, but really make the space for more stories that already exist. But yes, first, I agree. We need to stop telling the wrong story so loudly that it drowns out everything else, because that's what I think modern schooling does so successfully, unfortunately. So to me, the most important story we need now is the one where that's actually we actively suppress the stories that the world is alive and that we are not separate from it. And the story is still told through multiple different generations and storytelling traditions. And, it's been thousands of stories for generations that have been telling us that maybe that maybe the main point is to learn how we can listen to these stories, but also how we can maybe write stories with the world together, not just from the human perspective alone necessarily.
Thank you, Iveta. Do you feel that we haven't learned to break free of the grand narratives that was so predominant in sort of like in the early 20th century? The modernists were sort of, questioning these notions of grand narratives. It feels like we're still there. How do we understand that?
I think we are still there. And I think especially if we look at our education system, it's really interesting how we are so obsessed with the idea that there is only one way of educating children if we look at the modern schooling, right? And I think it's also interesting for us to remember, and I think memory comes into this place too, that before modern schooling was established about 200 years ago, we always learned with the earth and with each other, with the planet. But somehow these other ways of learning have really were pushed out and overwritten by the story of modern schooling in really powerful ways. So, and it's very difficult to critique modern schooling, especially in the current context where it's linked to the ideas of equity and access and sustainability. So it's a very delicate, I think, process of making space for other stories to come back into focus, to come into focus and to be part of the conversation about what learning is, what are possible futures in front of us.
Very interesting, because I don't think I'd ever really thought about education in terms of it being itself a grand narrative, or that modern schooling or mass education is something else you mentioned earlier as well as being part of a grand narrative. But it does underscore the disconnect and the growing disconnect that there appears to be between upcoming generations and generations of students, and the way we sort of perpetuate this modern schooling mass education model. And so I'm going to turn to you then, Manon, because if we're talking about disconnect amongst students, many students today feel climate grief, eco-anxiety is something that is very present in the media, or feel some kind of existential dislocation. So if we turn our attention back to the question of education and planetary well-being, what does planetary well-being require from our ways of teaching? Not just intellectually, but emotionally, because that's something you mentioned, and ethically.
Thank you. Yes. I think first we should imagine education not in a linear way, but in a cyclical way better. That means that usually when you go at university, you receive the course which is given by the teacher. So the student is really passive in a way he is interacting with the class and with the teacher itself, himself or herself. Then he has to succeed an exam and to be the better of the class. This is the linear way of finally continuing the global story of being the best in a company, the best in this institution. And so they also feel this fear of not being enough for the class, for their future projection in the world. So if we focus in education with a cyclical, as a cycle, in a cyclical way, we reinsert the individuation of the learner in the center of this pedagogical feature. For instance, we should give them the will, the experience to be part of the content itself. They should experience knowledge instead of receiving it. Then they should also they should be able to reflect on the knowledge they are receiving and they are taking part of. So this reflection, this reflexivity should be problematized to their own beliefs, their own word. There should be a continuity between what they already know and what they want to learn. So here there is also the question of the posture of the teacher to be aware of what the learner want to learn, in what world they want to be part of, and what can they bring to the world themselves. So that need to the students to know themselves, to experiment themselves, to be able to problematize, to reflect of the knowledge, and to critique the teacher. So finally, here is not, so we are totally changing the way we perceive education because we really give the possibility to act, to finally be a citizen himself or herself in the given context in the educative context, and we don't push them into the world after years and hours sitting down listening to someone who seems to be better or knowing more in comparison to what they already know. So we should give them the opportunity to express themselves and to be aware of who they are and what are their particularities, that they should bring this beautiful gift to the world. And by doing this, we consider teaching as a learning sanctuary and not as a learning grief of learning for learning to succeed, but we reconsider the intention into expressing ourselves instead of finally completing the objective of a macro structure. So here is a question of posture and of experiential learning with the reflexivity of what we know and from who we are, because we can't tell the same story to the learners depending on where do they come from. So we have to know our learners too, as teachers.
Yeah, thank you, Manon. I'm going to have to bring you back in here, Victoria, because Manon has spoken there quite extensively about experiential learning. Victoria, you mentioned project-based learning earlier on. The questions, Manon also introduced questions of reflexivity, of posture, of our position in the world, in society, at fractal levels, different sort of fractal levels. And Victoria, you mentioned UMA's programs are designed from the practitioner's point of view, right? It's very hands-on, very experiential, very project-based. I think you work with different profiles as well of actors involved in socio-environmental change, from lawyers to farmers, architects to entrepreneurs. How does one design, in practical terms, a curriculum where the metric of a success is not GDP, it's not economic competitiveness, again, as Manon reminds us, but what you speak very eloquently about, regeneration?
Well, certainly the focus there is on experiencing it, on exploring it, and on trying to measure it. So when we speak on project-based programs, we're not speaking about programs where we design things, but where we're actually inviting students to design and implement. Regeneration has several dimensions, but putting it very simply, we can speak about personal regeneration and relational regeneration and environmental regeneration. Personal and relational regeneration can be experienced in a short term. Environmental regeneration needs more of a medium and a longer term. So we have master's degrees that are 2 years long, bachelor's degrees that are 4 years long, and definitely personal and relational regeneration can be experienced quite fast. It's quite impressive. We have an incredible potential as humans to regenerate quite quickly in terms of the regeneration that is possible in the short term, which is ourselves and our relationships to others and to nature. So a curriculum that wants to bring forth this experience, not only the knowledge. There's knowledge involved here, but it's the knowledge has to go to knowing, to doing, to being. So you have to have the full range of that experience. So we invite them to do action research. That is to plan some actions in terms of, we actually pose them the challenge directly. So if you want to regenerate yourself, what is it that you can do now? And do it, plan it, do it, measure it, and do it cyclically. No, so what did you learn? So we do it in cycles. Cycle 1, what did you learn? Now what can you redesign in a second cycle using what you learned in the first cycle? So we try to teach this, as Manon was saying, this a learning process that is cyclical, where you can very explicitly identify what you learned on a first cycle and adapt it in a second cycle, and so on.
Yeah.
And so we start with the challenge of your personal regeneration, then with relational regeneration, and then with environmental regeneration, once that you've had more experience with the question of what does regeneration mean. And I just want to quickly say that I think it's very important that we concentrate not only in space, but also in time. I was just mentioning that before. So I think it's very common in this environment of reimagining education that we're speaking about the connection between us, or regenerating the connection between us and the planet. But I very seldom hear the regeneration of the connection we have, again, with our ancestors and our future generations. This is the reconnection in time. So when children or young people, as Manon was speaking, are feeling these anxieties, because they also disconnect from the story,
Sure.
the story of humans. If what we're feeling is we are the heroes, we are the generation that is going to fix the world. Every generation before has done everything horribly, and now we are going to fix everything. And of course, that creates a horrible anxiety. This is very different from feeling we are part of a process of a human species that is evolving, that is actually quite young. And we are doing this part, and we've inherited that part, and this is what we want to inherit to the others. So this idea of really incorporating the tribe notion of belonging to a species that is evolving in time, and not only reconnecting us in space. I think it's super important in terms of being practical in terms of regeneration.
Thank you, Victoria. You mentioned a lot of things there, and I understand this notion that if you want to achieve true reflexivity, which Manon was talking about, of course, this iterative process becomes absolutely fundamental. This cyclical approach becomes absolutely fundamental. And understanding that this iterative process also works at the level of past generations being our ancestors, and we are ancestors of future generations, and how we indeed construct that particular narrative that breaks away from, I suppose, to some degree, and I know, Iveta, we've had the chance in the past to talk about this sort of thing, breaks free from narrative structures like the hero's journey, where, of course, sometimes what can be problematic is that the pressure, the responsibility that you were talking about, Victoria, of being the hero of one's own journey is one thing. Being the hero of a collective journey is a different level of responsibility. And putting responsibilities on future generations to save the planet that we know and that allows us to survive is a huge responsibility that we're passing on to future generations. But Iveta, if I can turn to you, how for you, because I know you've thought about this, we've spoken about how the teaching itself, the teaching framework itself, must evolve. We've talked about how things work at the level of the individual, at the level of society, at the level of the planet, in the way societies interact with the biosphere. We've spoken about the learner's position in the classroom, the learner's position in the field, etc. But how does this translate to the level of policy, of education policy? How do we make it something that has that sort of institutional force behind it?
That's such a great question, Raphael, too. And I feel like we're coming also in circles discussing all of the different aspects of the learning systems, too. So it's really nice to see this spiraling of the conversation. So I'm glad we got to the policy now. I think the biggest problem with education policy that it still treats the environment as if it were an optional chapter, kind of an issue area, as you said, that that you get to after you covered all the other real, so to speak, in quotes, priorities. But the environment isn't an issue area. It's the condition for every single thing we care about, from health and stability to learning and economies and futures. It's part of everything. And so and it's interesting to me that in education policy, it's not as central as it should be. So, and there are a couple of things I think how we can recenter it in the education policy conversations and debates, and I think one of the maybe strategies is to delink the kind of the metrics that we designed around education success from economic growth and from the growth logic maybe more broadly. So if our metrics continue to focus on GDP and standardized performance and labor market readiness, we will simply perfect the machinery that's driving the collapse. Metrics, I would argue, must shift towards resilience, relational capacity, ecological literacy, collective well-being, intergenerational responsibilities. So all these aspects that both Manon and Victoria have been discussing already as well. So I think first and foremost, delinking education from the economic growth, which is also very difficult, but not impossible. So for me, it's really interesting why we continue to keep looking at how education contributes to GDP growth, and at the same time, not considering how levels of schooling contribute to the ecological, environmental footprint, for example, right? So we have all kinds of ranking of countries in terms of this connection between education and GDP growth, but not looking at the environmental footprint. And if we compare even, very briefly, if we look at the data, we will see that the countries with the largest GDP growth also have the largest ecological footprint for the most part, right? And I'm generalizing here, but we never really look at this puzzle kind of more holistically. So I think this is one maybe move that we could do. And I think it kind of disorients us a little bit, but also maybe helps shift how we think about policy differently. I think we also should try to decenter the human in the policies somehow as well, and not in a way that diminishes us, but in a way that locates us more accurately in the ecological system and the ecological community as one species among many, dependent on systems that we cannot necessarily control. So education policy can recognize also that learning is embedded in ecological and cultural context and not really abstracted from them. And I think also it's really important to think about the governance, education governance structures that listen beyond themselves as well. That means incorporating insights from indigenous communities, from youth movements, from climate science, from more than human knowledge traditions into the policy making. And I think there are ways of doing this. Kind of, designing the whole process of education policy that is accountable not only to voters and short-term interests, but to the future generations and future life stories. And so it's kind of like not a technical fix, but more a paradigm shift that also policy has to be a part of.
De-link, de-center. It seems there's a pattern emerging. Planetary well-being is relational between people, ecosystems, policy, place, future lives. And education in that sense becomes a training in interdependence, which is something that all three of you have mentioned today. Now, before we close today's episode, the final question, the question we ask each of our guests on this series, and that is this. If you could go back to your student days or forward to a curriculum not yet written, what subject do you wish you could have studied but never had the chance to? And Victoria, if I can put that question to you first, please.
Actually, I feel that I study all the time. I learn things all the time of whatever I'm interested in. So I don't relate to that question in terms of what would I've done differently. Nothing. What would I like to study? Well, I do right now all the time. Whenever an interest emerges, I research it, talk about it, look for people that are involved in it. So I do really walk the talk in the sense of I'm passionate about learning. So I don't think there's anything that I would like to learn right now that I am not learning. So whatever I like to learn, I am learning somehow. Of course, there are more things that I want to learn that I can have time for. So there's a sort of an order or a priority. Right now, for example, I'm keen on learning more about earth sciences, about the relationship between development of consciousness and pedagogy. That's another line, and also cultural evolution. Iveta was mentioning this idea of the pluriverses, and that's certainly, I'm sure, an idea that we all engage with. But for me, it also has a limit. There's not such a thing as an infinite and you know with no frontiers. No, there's not every story is a good story from each of our points of view. There are some stories we actually do not like and we do not want. So in the pluriverse, there are some stories that we would like them not to evolve. For example, like colonialist stories or narratives or ways of seeing the world, or oppressive or slavist narratives. So there are a bunch of stories that we don't want in the pluriverse. So what up with cultural evolution regarding that? So that's one big question and big interest that I have right now that I'm trying to address.
Thank you, Victoria. A true example of lifelong learning. I put the same question to you, Iveta, if I may.
Absolutely. Great. So I will go back to my university days and think about what I wish I could have studied, but never had a chance to. So in the university, I was always fascinated by the idea of international relations. And partially maybe because I grew up as the Soviet Union was collapsing. So for me, just kind of understanding the international relations always sounded really fascinating. And of course, you could study it at the university, right? The idea is that nations, cultures, and political systems are constantly shaping one another. But I think in the retrospect, I always knew that something was missing, and that system, that subject area was so narrow and so elite, and only open to particular political subjects for participation, and only accountable to relationships between states, when we know that the real forces shaping our futures are so much bigger. They are ecosystems and climates and species and technologies and ancestors and futures we haven't even met yet. So I wish there was such a thing as more than human relations, not international relations, but the subjects that would be from the very beginning framed much more broadly, and that anybody could learn it. Anybody would learn it.
Thank you very much, Iveta.
And maybe
finally,
already Victoria has such a subject in her university.
And finally, if I may, I'll turn to you, Manon.
Yes, when I was thinking about this question, I wonder that if I could have a school as as Victoria is doing with UMA, I think is amazing to connect all those aspects of ecological matters. But since I'm not in Mexico for now, I think I am really happy with this study on my PhD about how to give this planetary sense of belonging to students at the university in France. So I will stay with that, with this lifelong research. Maybe, I don't know.
Thank you very much to all three of our guests, Manon Sala, Iveta Silova, and Victoria Haro. You've been listening to React, Reimagining Education in the Age of Crises and Transitions, a podcast from the Learning Planet Institute, recorded as part of the Learning Planet Festival in celebration of International Day of Education. My thanks to our guests and to you for listening. I'm Raphael Costambeys-Kempczynski. Thank you for joining us in this continuing experiment in hope. And a special thank you to our production team, Etienne Carlen, Maria-Angelica Mejia Caceres, and Edouard Picard, for bringing these conversations to life.
Learning Planet Institute.